I've got Ben Curran here, who's a cloud solutions architect with Microsoft. And we're here today to talk about DevOps because I can tell you for one, I've got a lot of stupid questions about DevOps, and I'm good at asking stupid questions about things I don't know enough about, and I'm really keen to learn a lot more about it. It's obviously roles that I'm starting to recruit a lot more for now, and it's becoming a very popular area of specialization within the IT industry. And so I know, to start off with also, I know there's a lot of IT support people out there, there's a lot of sysadmins that I speak to about wanting to know more about DevOps and how to break into DevOps as a career as well. So we're going to delve into those kind of subjects with Ben, but to start off with, I just want to get your take, Ben, on what is DevOps?
So DevOps, it's interesting that you say you want to learn more, because that's one of the basic things about DevOps is learning from everything you do. So there's that, you have your, the three main laws of DevOps is your flow, you've been able to get from the start to the finish or end to end for a particular piece of work. Then there's the feedback loop of being able to make that repeatable, and then full learnings throughout the entire time you're doing things. So closing down that feedback loop, so getting from A to B as quickly as possible, and then learning from it as quickly as possible as well. So to me, DevOps is all about making sure you're learning as much as you can, be curious, and create efficiencies from your learnings. So in DevOps, there's such a concept of blameless postmortems, where even if something goes wrong, or even if something just finishes and goes right, you go through and make sure that you learn why it went right or why it went wrong without actually pointing any fingers at particular people or teams or anything like that. You focus more on the process and the technology in those things. So what processes can be improved to make sure it doesn't happen again? What technology can we implement or even remove to make sure things don't go wrong the next time?
Okay, so if I'm a sysadmin, why do I need to know about DevOps, and how does that relate to my current role?
So the key part of DevOps in terms of a sysadmin is being that kind of master of automation, making sure that you get out of the way of developers or development teams wanting to get, and also the business wanting to get their product to market as quickly as possible. And that's why you have those learnings and and that flow as much as possible. So the main areas that a sysadmin would look at is things like automation, making sure you've got scripts in place to automatically provision and bring up infrastructure as needed and things like that, and make sure that configuration is done via code and automatically done throughout an entire fleet. Make it scalable effectively.
Okay, so you mentioned product. So is it mainly used in environments where perhaps a company produces their own software product and they need a scalable environment that can be automatically,
So that is where it kind of came from, but it can be applied much to businesses where necessarily a product is not your goal. I've seen DevOps used quite effectively in the mining industry, where the product is the dirt they dig out of the ground and put on a ship somewhere. It's not DevOps doesn't affect the business value chain there, but it does impact the delivery of support infrastructure to support that area. So you can create sub products within your company that your customer could even be an internal stakeholder as well. So you still develop a product, but it's not necessarily sold to a customer.
Okay. So look, say I'm a systems engineer or a sysadmin, and my usual way of going about my work is that, maybe I work for a software company, let's say that, right? They develop an app. And the usual thing is the software developers come to me and say, oh, we need a new dev environment, or we need a new server added to a dev environment that's a web server. And so I provision a new virtual server, I install using the USB key or a template I've already got for Windows. I install it, I set up an IIS server for them, I configure all the, sort of configuration things manually. Why not just do that? To ask the question another way, how does a DevOps process around that help me, in providing for my dev team?
So a DevOps process will help you provide that by ensuring that you have everything you need, everything that the developer needs delivered as quickly and easily as possible. So you look at, okay, how many dev teams are asking for a server? Okay, you can make a template out of that, and you can do that variety of ways: PowerShell, shell scripts, Python scripts. But I mean, a lot of the DevOps space uses infrastructure as code. So that's creating a definition of what an infrastructure is. So you say, I want a server with 1 network card and 128 gig of storage, and deploy it here. So you can deploy it to any cloud or even on-prem. So there are certain infrastructure as code providers have capabilities to talk with VMware, Hyper-V, Red Hat OpenShift, the whole works. So you can, even if you're not working in cloud, you can still do infrastructure as code to quickly and reliably and repeatably deploy solutions for your internal customers, such as developers.
Brilliant. Okay, so you can effectively create a script, if you like, that where you can define a server is, right? Or for example, a Windows server is, and then outline, a Windows 2019, for example, server, install process, which is all scripted.
Yep.
And you can use variables for memory and disk space,
Exactly,
etc.
yeah.
And then choose the environment you want to deploy it to. So Azure, in a cloud environment, or maybe VMware if it's on-prem, or that kind of thing. And you can actually automate that whole process of the server build, for example.
100%. Yeah, that's exactly how to get it done. One of my first DevOps roles or DevOps experiences was actually creating that scripted environment with which to, like, we were doing a migration from on-prem VMware to a cloud provider, and we took it and I wrote a script which read the VM definition out of VMware, exported the disks to storage, and then went to the cloud provider, and I had a little lookup table to say, okay, with this amount of CPU and this amount of memory, create this particular type of VM, go do it, attach these, upload the disks, attach them, done. And it would migrate just one to one. And instead of having to sit there for hours and hours and hours, manually right-clicking, download, upload, create VM, I could sit there and run it overnight, and it would upload 10 VMs.
Wow.
And I could go to bed and have some sleep.
Which is always great when you're in IT. You get some sleep when you can.
Yeah, it's kind of like the saying, like, the best sysadmin is the lazy sysadmin, because they will automate themselves out of needing to do anything.
Absolutely. Oh, great example. So that we can consider that as DevOps, that infrastructure as a code, effectively, building whole server systems purely based off coding, particular objects within your script.
And that was all in the quest to have that flow, so quickly move things across and do it repeatedly and learn. And each time I ran it, I looked at the logs and was like, okay, I could do this better. I could do this better. So I implemented my learnings every time I iterated. So iterate often to get the better result each time. So like my first one, I had to babysit a little bit and work and keep an eye on it. Towards the end, I was just saying, yep, 10 servers overnight, go. I'm off. I didn't worry about it because I knew that it would help. I even implemented alerts into it, so it would send me an SMS if something went wrong. So I knew, okay, something went wrong, I need to go fix it.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, so what are the typical skills that you're really looking for if you're wanting to get into DevOps? What do you really need to develop? Particularly, let's say, if you come from that more infrastructure type background, traditional on-prem environment, Windows servers, or even IT support, and you want to break into, DevOps. What are the sort of skills that you should be, looking to develop?
So the usual skills I'd look at is curiosity, like a passion to learn, because learning something new every day is very important to DevOps, particularly as technology, especially cloud technology these days, is changing every day, every week. There's no way to get away from it. If you're not learning, you're falling behind. So very much a passion to learn. The kind of skills you should look at is in particular with needing to do automation, is look at things like scripting languages like PowerShell and Bash scripting. Python is also a very powerful tool in that space. You do have to, it isn't usually built in natively, but you do have to have that capability in place. Just being able to understand what your customers are wanting. So having that kind of soft skill of being able to talk with someone who is asking for something and being able to fish out, like, here's the little details of, I need to be able to do this.
Yeah.
So, and that could be like putting someone in between yourself and the user, like a product owner or a scrum master or someone like that. But yeah, it's like being able to understand what the need is, so then you can best deliver to it.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. So really, customer need is a big thing, as often in most roles, but understanding what the deliverables are going to be at the end of the day in terms of what you're trying to achieve. And then using effectively scripting tools, a lot of scripts, and knowing, I suppose, the dev environment, or the tools around DevOps that implement those scripts, and then monitoring them, how they run, and the results at the end.
Understanding the process is important there. So like being able to, like, when you're creating a script, the first thing I'll usually do is I'll go through and manually do it and write down each of the steps I've taken to do it. And then I'll turn each of those steps into a part of a script. So I create kind of pseudocode of do this, then do this, then do this, or do this many times. So you have a loop there. And then what you then can do is flesh each of those out into a purpose, a piece of the script to do a thing. And so that's why I say understand the customer need, because you need to understand how they want to get from A to B, so then you can automate A to B.
Could we go through maybe what some of those customer needs might be, real world scenarios where DevOps is used?
Things like usually a lot of the time you'll have teams coming to you and saying, we need a way to be able to deploy this piece of code. So a developer has written a .NET app, for example. You need to understand, okay, what hosting needs do they have? Where do we need to deploy this? And then go, okay, I'm going to deploy a server and make sure IIS is installed, maybe SQL is installed if they've got a database, or there's a SQL instance somewhere to do that. And then deploy the application into the runtime of that particular server. So a .NET web app would be deployed into your IIS web root, things like that. So being able to go, okay, here's the process. I start with nothing, and then go, I need a server, I need a network connection, so IP addressing, I need IIS installed, so I need Windows, IIS, this particular plugin, do that. And then you go through, okay, they've given me their code, I then need to build it, package it, and deploy it into that particular server. So the scripts you would use to do that, and often a lot of the CI/CD tools, so continuous integration, continuous deployment, or delivery tools, will give you kind of templates for doing that. So here's a templated step to deploy a server in a cloud provider. Here's a templated thing to configure that server using PowerShell DSC or Ansible or something like that. And then here's a step to build and deploy a .NET app. So you can then understand exactly the steps going through that.
Okay. And the advantage of that, I'm thinking, we're talking about a .NET app here, provisioning a .NET app. The advantage here for a development team, I'm imagining, is they're making changes to this code all the time. They get to the stage where they've got a version they want to test, for example. They basically hand it over to the DevOps team to say, okay, put this into an environment where we can, test it as if it's a production environment. You just run that script or not run that script,
pipeline.
but that pipeline, exactly, that's the term, that pipeline, and it pushes that out.
And a good pipeline will have variables at the very start of it to say, this is prod, this is test, this is dev. And then, so you say, run the dev pipeline, it will go deploy the infrastructure, deploy the code, run the tests, tear down the infrastructure. So then at the end of and then output the test information to a framework or something like that, where they can go and review and make sure everything is working.
Okay, perfect. So let's take DevOps out of that. What's the old way of doing that?
The old way of doing that is a developer will raise a service desk ticket across to your networking team to get an IP address across, and firewall changes across to your hosting team to go and deploy a server, across to your Wintel team to go log onto the server and install IIS for them, and then eventually they have to hand over a packaged piece of code to a Windows sysadmin to go and deploy into a thing. And yeah, all of those handoffs and handovers just end up with creating delay upon delay upon delay. So in those old kind of days, it would take 4 weeks to deploy a dev environment, because you're having to wait for the network team to have availability, have to wait for the hosting team to do that, you have to wait for the Windows team, you have to maybe wait for your testers to be available to test on that, and then then that dev, and then you might not have that dev environment afterwards to be able to retest if something goes wrong. Whereas this, you can compress that down into a day. There's companies who go on like how many deployments per day they do using DevOps. So like I think Microsoft, I think we're in the thousands of deployments a day on all of our products.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
And is this? I mean, I imagine when if you go into a production environment, you kind of do that once typically, but so the savings probably aren't huge when you're just simply going from dev to production environment. But I imagine testing, you're redoing that environment all the time. And that's where part of the benefits would come, I imagine.
I mean, not necessarily. I mean, there is a like ideal behind DevOps to like pure DevOps to be, you deploy, everything goes to production. Like that loop, that A to B is in production. Like it's not you write code and then it goes to dev. That's not that loop. It is you have an idea for something and then it's in production is the end point. So having, like when I say we've got 4,000 deployments per day, 4,000 deployments or thousands of deployments per day, it's thousands of deployments to production per day.
Right. Okay.
So that's not including the dev and test layers underneath it. It is we deploy to prod.
Right. Okay. And there's obviously testing on the way.
Of course, yes.
That process.
But that's the thing, having that testing and observability in place to make sure that the testing is automated, the observability is there to make sure you get the correct feedback and information, and then one of my favorite stickers on my laptop is release does not equal production. So when you release your code, it goes to a production environment, but only certain subset of your users are actually impacted by it. So you can then test in production against those users, and if they don't have problems, then you start deploying wider. So you see a lot of cloud companies, when they deploy new code into their platform, they'll usually start with places that are smaller. So you usually go and usually chasing the sun. So you start with New Zealand, Australia, before you actually hit America and where your big markets are.
Okay, so if I've got this right, in a typical .NET application release, let's say that we're on version 2.0 or something that's being released of a .NET application. So it's already in production. Version 1's in production. We're going to now release version 2. A DevOps chain, I suppose, would start off with the dev team saying, right, this is version 2. We want to push this out to production now. The DevOps chain would include writing presumably a whole new server environment for version 2, but also doing automated testing on the way. Is automated testing part of DevOps?
Yes, 100%. Right. So yeah, it's making sure that what you're releasing is true to what you intend to release. So and testing happens in infrastructure as well. So you would create your scripts and then test them against older environments to make sure that they're still getting the same impact at the end of the day. The same intent equals the impact. So But I mean, you look at like that kind of idea of releasing version 2.0 on separate infrastructure and separate on one day your version 1, next day your version 2. That's not how a lot of it's done these days. A lot of it, like you look at a site like LinkedIn. LinkedIn has had 8 separate versions over the last 15 years.
Right.
Have you ever known LinkedIn to ever go down or say, we're version 2 now or we're version 3? Yeah. No, because they just make their changes and they make such small incremental changes, iterative changes over time that you do go through version 1, version 2, version 3, version 4 without noticing that you've actually gone through those versions. Yeah. It's just still linked into us.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, and that's kind of like a very cloud native way or a digital native way of thinking about releasing your product. Because I mean, that's the thing, their product is their website.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so it's that iterative change process that happens, and I suppose so. Coming back to what the role of a DevOps engineer is in that whole process, typically, what would the DevOps engineer do when LinkedIn say, okay, we're ready to start rolling out the new release? What's the role of that DevOps engineer?
To just continue to work on the environment, continuously improve things. So that's the main goal behind it is that having that feedback loop to continuously improve. So and improve their daily work day to day. So making sure that they're learning new skills, learning new capabilities, so then that can be folded into the product as it moves along day to day as well.
Okay, but they don't touch the LinkedIn code, for example, right? The actual website that LinkedIn is, the code behind it. They're not so much touching that. That's the dev department, the software developers that do that. But they're doing everything else in between to getting that to the production environment in a coded kind of hands-off way. Would that be fair?
A little bit, yeah. So their main role is to ensure that there's always fresh infrastructure provisioned and available for dev to be able to expand into and upgrade into. So, I mean, it kind of is a rolling update capability. So, like you say, for example, if you have on-prem and you have a set of servers that are 5-year lifespans, you're making sure that those things coming down in the 5th year are being able to be removed gracefully with stuff behind it, being able to raise the capability behind it. So when you remove that infrastructure, nothing gets impacted. That's starting to move into like full distributed systems thinking as well.
Okay. But DevOps is definitely on the infrastructure side from what we're saying then.
So pure DevOps is usually like thought about right in the middle, more a developer thing than a infrastructure thing. But DevOps in reality is very much infrastructure working with developers to create a capability to make sure that when something is delivered, it is operationally supported. So making sure that it's bringing developers and ops teams closer together. And there's several different patterns on DevOps. Some of them are good patterns, some of them are not so good patterns, like having that kind of separate DevOps team sitting in between as kind of the translation layer between the dev team and the ops team. A lot of teams are just going, okay, we will relabel ops to DevOps, but you still need to have some overlap with that dev team. You still need to have some capability in that developer space. When I say developer space, I mean programming languages of any type. So it can be scripting, it can be PowerShell and Shell, it can be Python. You don't need to be full into the dev space. You just need to be overlapped with them a little.
Yeah, okay, all right.
And understand what the developers are going through.
Yes, exactly. Okay, so if I've got this right, as a DevOps engineer, you're not needing to understand how to write a .NET application yourself. So it's not actually the writing of an application and you don't need those sort of languages under your belt in terms of development. But it's more akin to scripting, like a sysadmin would use PowerShell to script to automate their tasks a lot easier, like the lazy sysadmin.
And also using other tools that may make that easy for you as well. So things like Terraform for infrastructure as code, Packer for creating VM images, Ansible for doing configuration on a VM, on a OS once it's deployed.
Okay.
So understanding those, because a lot of those use very developer style languages. So they use like certain languages like JSON or YAML to define themselves. And you have to have a little bit of a developer mentality to go, okay, I want to be able to do like doing things like looping and iteration on a variable size environments and things like that.
Yeah.
So
okay.
yeah.
And I'd imagine this is where too sysadmins or IT support people tend to want to go into DevOps because they understand the ops side of it, or they already understand the infrastructure side of it, which if you've come from purely a software development background, you may not understand, or you may not have ever created a virtual server before, or you may not understand how PowerShell works, or how even I suppose different objects in a Windows Server System environment work. And
that's a lot of the time the challenge with DevOps is kind of bringing, like I found a lot of the time ops people are quite good at being able to do that running of the infrastructure once it's deployed and understanding what infrastructure needs to be there. But then the developers are usually, I write code and I deploy it and I don't want to see it again. It's a bit of a mindset shift to be able to bring those two together. And I've had very success with both sides. Like I've been able to teach infrastructure people or sysadmins how to code and how to use PowerShell and Python to achieve really great things in their careers, but also been able to get a developer to understand their infrastructure that sits underneath their code, so then they can work with a DevOps engineer or be a DevOps engineer to be able to create that automation to make sure end to end their solution is serviced.
Okay, brilliant. Yep. All right. I want to now just deal with a couple of, I suppose, related fields to DevOps, and maybe you can tell me how they fit in. So let's start with site reliability engineers, or SREs. What are they, and how do they relate to a DevOps sort of environment? Or
so I mean, they're very similar to a DevOps engineer kind of role. Usually, a lot of companies will use those two terms interchangeably. Some of them will use it as a kind of an evolution of a DevOps person. Site reliability engineering is a practice that was kind of developed by Google. So the original site reliability engineering guide was written by Google engineers to run Google infrastructure underneath the covers at Google. So they developed it and published it and made it so other people could also practice the same kind of engineering practices at their own environment. So and people kind of taken that on as so platform engineering and site reliability engineering tend to also get used in the same sentences as well. So what it's more about is creating that team who don't necessarily do code, but they still have enough coding capability to build their own tools, to know how the environment works so well that they can make sure that it's all about reliability. It's all about making sure that things stay up and are up as much as possible. So site reliability engineering is where a concept like Kubernetes came out, because Kubernetes is meant to be this self-healing, self-running kind of containerized environment. So they apply SRE to that, and you can then run an entire environment using containers. And things will auto heal. Like if something goes down, it'll automatically destroy it and create a new one, and make sure your site is running as reliably as possible.
Okay. All right.
So getting a team who can think about that reliability place in their platform is key to that.
Okay, so it's more a mindset. I mean, I know it's described as a role, but it's more a mindset that those engineers bring to existing DevOps sort of roles. Is that fair?
And usually a capability of kind of evolving that into building your own tools to be able to achieve that as well.
Okay. So they're not necessarily building the traditional DevOps kind of process, if you like, going from developer .NET application to production environment and iterating all that in between, but they're looking at that whole process with site reliability eyes and their own site reliability tools, and saying, how can we make this self-healing and better.
And also creating that environment that developers can just deploy into and not have to worry about, is the platform okay? Do I have everything I need to be able to run? Because the platform should provide everything that they need.
Okay, yeah. And I can see how closely they're aligned to DevOps engineers, because you'd think a good DevOps engineer should probably have a lot of those same sort of skill sets and be thinking along those same lines, as in, uptime's essential, and and we're going to keep making the process better to achieve that.
It's very much around the saying same but different.
And also, I suppose site reliability to me seems to indicate that once it's also up, that keeping it up, from an operational perspective. So I imagine that comes into play a little bit as well.
It's always about chasing that uptime goal of like 5 nines or something like that.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah. And interesting that it's now become a role in its own right. So
yeah.
Fantastic. Okay. And testing automation, again, it seems to be just a little bit off to the side, but part of the DevOps process going from dev to production.
And that's because testing is part of the learning cycle, like being able to get that quick feedback of, okay, I've made a change, what happens? And that testing phase allows you to get that feedback very quickly. It may not necessarily be entirely against production data or a production environment, so it might not necessarily be like, let's test it against 1 million users a day. But it gives you enough information to be able to learn a little bit. And then once it's in, and then there's the idea of testing in production, where you're testing things and making sure they still work against a subset of users with production data to make sure that you get the information back.
Which again is all a fairly automated process, isn't it? Because that first iteration, when it goes to production, is just a subset of those LinkedIn users. If to use LinkedIn as a term that that LinkedIn has described as, well, this is going to be the pilot group each time.
They kind of look at who are our heavy users, or who are our important users who will give us feedback, and they usually send it off to them. Usually their own employees.
Yes, sure. And then, like you say, that data is then brought back into the iteration process, both back to the dev team, I'm imagining, as well as to the DevOps team, because the DevOps team will deal with any sort of infrastructure operational type
so things like network slowness, latency, things like that. Say, this is running really slow. Okay, I don't like that because it runs slow. It goes back to the DevOps team to say, okay, how can we remove latency from this environment?
And presumably smart DevOps engineers will also look at some of those slowness type issues and say, well, actually it's slow because it was coded poorly, not because the operational production environment wasn't good enough, and then send it back to the dev.
We don't like to blame anyone, but usually, yes, blame the devs. Blame the devs.
And I'm not going to get into a political argument here. All I'm saying is, they have to determine that. Like, they're the first port of call, presumably, on that feedback loop back. That if it's not a network or server or production kind of issue, in that operational issue in that sense, then it's presumably a coding issue.
And that's where that kind of DevOps concept evolves. Like, it usually starts off in a company as like, this is the things sysadmins are doing to get better at being able to deploy things. But eventually the evolution kind of brings your devs closer and closer and closer until you're effectively embedded with them. So then that feedback loop does go to the devs immediately because they're part of the DevOps team already. So and usually creating a group of with mixtures of networking, security, hosting capabilities in a DevOps team. So then we all kind of cross-pollinate between each other. So like, you can teach a developer networking stuff by having a network advocate in that team. So, but that means at the end of the day, you end up with the feedback going to the person who can fix it inside that team, rather than having to go across to another team.
Yeah, makes sense. Which is where it becomes such
the ideal.
Team environment, solving these problems. Whereas if they were highly, siloed teams, the dev team and the sysadmin team or the operations team, this is where I suppose it comes together in the whole DevOps role.
And the amount of times where you end up, particularly in organizations where they are heavily siloed, with a ticket which is not quite a network issue but not quite a code issue, just bouncing between the networking dev teams and the sysadmin teams, because, well, network don't want to deal with it, devs don't want to deal with it, so the sysadmins have to end up dealing with it. That's the classic story, and that's why you remove those silos, break those silos in, and create that cross-functional team to make sure that someone in that team can deal with it, or
which is DevOps.
That team as a group can deal with it.
Great, and that's how DevOps came about.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So that's why we're here. Awesome. Excellent. Full circle. That's great. So let's go back to our avatar. You, the sysadmin, the IT support person, perhaps the software developer. You know, you want to break into DevOps. Let's recap and say, okay, what are the tools? What are the websites they can go to? What are the things they should be doing now? You know, to train themselves up to be attractive to an employer that might want to hire someone, you know, in a first DevOps role.
So, I mean, the most important thing is 100% definitely have a passion for learning, have a growth mindset at the end to start with, because employers will always look upon someone who is willing to learn over someone who already knows everything. Because if you're willing to learn, you can learn how they do things. But also, there are a ton of free learning resources available on the internet. Microsoft in particular has our full Microsoft Learn, learn.microsoft.com. There it has all of our cloud and desktop and server resources to be able to learn how to do those things, including labs and things like that. But there's also, like, I mean, I started off myself with learning from a cloud guru to learn how to do cloud. I thought they were doing really amazing work. They're now part of Pluralsight. That's a website, a cloud guru.
Yep. Okay.
They're now part of Pluralsight as well. So they've expanded their capabilities.
Yep.
Also, just looking on YouTube and Reddit for learning resources. So I found, particularly for learning some of the lowdown sysadmin stuff and network admin stuff, there's a YouTuber called Network Chuck, who has a really great presentation, who is also really into coffee, which speaks to me really well.
Me too, yeah. Which we can now, by the way.
Yeah, so he does a lot of really understandable lessons on how to do networking and how to do security and how to do Unix admin stuff. So yeah, but and also there's some YouTubers around who they stream their learning of PowerShell 30-day PowerShell in a month of lunches, which is a really great book if you get it. Because so
it's a book, PowerShell in a month of lunches.
Yep, and it's broken down into things you can learn in an hour per day for a month.
Oh, fantastic.
So it's like, here's how to do arrays, and it's enough to be able to read and practice within a lunch hour.
Right.
So, like literally in a month of lunches. And yeah, so and there's a lot of different people like that who can do that. And also where I started learning code back in my earlier in my career, Code Academy, they do some really great courses as well on a lot of DevOps stuff as well as a lot of developer stuff.
Fantastic. All right, brilliant. Oh, that's great stuff. So learn.microsoft.com for the general sort of learning around certifications for
Microsoft and even not for certifications, they just have learning paths on particular things of interest as well.
So there's a DevOps path there for them. Yep. There's Network Chuck on YouTube. There's Pluralsight, of course, a massive learning environment.
And they always have free courses every month as well, so that they rotate through those, so you can learn all sorts of things there. They also have a lot of Linux stuff because they did by, I think, Linux Academy.
Okay. Yep. And Linux, very quickly, is related to DevOps because a lot of servers still run on it.
Yeah. I mean, it is doesn't matter where it lives, it should be able to run. So yeah, you can run on Windows, you can run on Linux. There's ways, you need ways to be able to do either of those. Yeah, absolutely. There's PowerShell in a month of lunches. And that's a book, a hard copy. There's a book, but also there's an online site, and there's also a YouTube series to guide you through it as well.
Fantastic. Okay, and PowerShell is great because that links it to the infrastructure side of things from a Windows point of view anyway.
100%.
So you need to, learning PowerShell, particularly if you're going to do any kind of Microsoft DevOps environment, is going to be so handy for you, even if you're a current sysadmin. I mean, PowerShell is one of those staples, isn't it, that can take you so far.
Oh, the amount of scripts that I wrote back when I was a sysadmin to be able to achieve things in my, like, if I just need to look something up, I would go to a PowerShell script to do it, because if I need to look it up again later, I just run that script again.
Yeah.
Done.
Yeah.
So yeah, PowerShell, Bash scripting on Linux, although PowerShell is available on any of those platforms.
Yeah.
And infrastructure as code is very important. So depending on who you're looking at, every cloud provider has their own infrastructure as code capability.
Yeah.
ARM templates, CloudFormation, two examples. But there's also these platform agnostic ones like Terraform from HashiCorp, who have a whole suite of tools available, which are all DevOps staples. You'll find them everywhere you do DevOps.
Excellent. Okay. Yeah. Brilliant. So, and just to be clear, what we're talking about here is you don't need to learn coding from an application development point of view. We're talking about coding from a scripting point of view, which is why we're talking about things like PowerShell, Python, and anything else typically that comes in.
Shell scripting.
Shell. Yeah. Okay. Yep. Perfect. Yep. Brilliant. So I suppose they're the key skills to focus on when you're talking about moving into a DevOps environment. It's going to be about scripting and learning, I suppose, then the tools around those scripts that produce that DevOps outcome, which is ultimately pushing through to a production environment, which are things that we've mentioned like Terraform, Ansible. What are the other key?
PowerShell desired state config, DSC, and Packer, which is a common tool, again, HashiCorp tool for creating VM images. So what it does is it takes a base image of an OS and then inserts things, bakes it all in, creates that golden image.
Yep, beautiful, excellent. Okay. Well, look, I hope that's provided you a whole lot of value there. There's certainly a lot of knowledge that's come through from Ben there, so I'm incredibly thankful, Ben, that you've done that. And Ben's an interesting guy. He's actually, his career has been really interesting. He's sort of alluded to, he's gone from this, IT support guy working in smaller MSPs to then a sort of sysadmin working in a very large MSP, and then kind of almost ditched IT for a while before you found DevOps, and that kind of rekindled your interest in it.
Changed my life.
Changed your life.
Literally.
Well, there you go. Brilliant. So we wouldn't be sitting here now if it wasn't for DevOps, and you've led teams, in large organizations around DevOps, and now of course you're a cloud solutions architect at Microsoft. So, I think once you called that to me as your kind of dream goal in the end was to work for a company like Microsoft. So, and you're there, and DevOps took you there. So
exactly.
In a short period of time. So that conversation is one we'll have a bit later. So we'll record that separately too, and you can look out for that one on our social media sources. So I'm Daniel Linden, Transparency IT, an IT recruiter in Perth, and I hope this has been really valuable for you.